So let's move into our next session. We've had a vibrant discussion this morning about the education system in various parts of the world. And now we're going to delve into a job market trend that is growing in importance, particularly in our digital world, and that is the gig economy. So what is that precisely? Well, according to a quick Google search or quick Google definition, this is a labor market characterized by the prevalence of short contracts or freelance work as opposed to permanent jobs. And in today's economy, as I said, that is becoming more and more prevalent. Today, we are thrilled to welcome two gig workers who will share their experiences and insights with us. First up is Jonathan Norgrove. From the time he could hold a pencil, Jonathan was drawing and telling outlandish stories with his art. He went on to study graphic design at the Barbados Community College and subsequently traditional animation at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, New York for 4 years. While living in New York City, Jonathan had the pleasure of working on a Jim Henson animated production, Sid the Science Kid, as well as a brief stint at Little Airplane Productions before returning to Barbados. Back home, he taught graphic design, animation, and video editing at the University of the West Indies and became an illustrator, animator, graphic designer, and video editor for Red Advertising and Marketing Limited, where he was responsible for design solutions on a bevy of large brands. He is currently a freelance animator and graphic designer, working under his personal banner, Studio Moose. Please welcome Jonathan Norgrove, who will share about his experience in the animation industry. Jonathan?
Hi guys, my name is Jonathan Norgrove and I've been a professional animator in Barbados for about 12 years now. Saying that got me feeling real old, so we'll just move past that as quickly as possible. I trained as a traditional animator at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and today I want to go through the various disciplines you can pursue in the field of animation. Over my years in the business, I've found that it can be easy to both oversimplify and overcomplicate the medium of animation in a number of ways. People can feel like they get pigeonholed into either one very specific thing or become very overwhelmed thinking they need to be amazing at every facet of the art form. And there's certainly a lot of merit to those fears. I totally understand that from personal experience, especially when I was a student back in, cave person days.
Cave person days.
Which is why I think it's helpful to break down the different principles within animation as a whole and focus your vision on one or two things you truly want to get into and get good at. There's a tendency, not just with animation, but with art in general, for people outside of the field to not quite understand the process. Not that it's their job to understand the process, but it is helpful for you and them to make sure they know what's going on so that they don't have unreasonable expectations. People tend to think that drawing is fun, and it is, but by extension of thinking that it's fun, they also think that it's easy, and therefore subconsciously they harbor this idea that it isn't really work. And if it isn't really work, then you as an artist should be able to get things done quickly and really easily. And of course, we know that this couldn't be farther from the truth. The actual truth is, all these shows that we love, all these lavishly animated commercials, films, video games, they're all created by teams of people. Sometimes in Disney animation, there's an entire team of animators responsible for animating a single character. Sometimes these teams are spread across several different countries, continents, and cultures, communicating and working toward a singular goal. As a matter of fact, most of what we call American animation, especially throughout the 80s and the early 90s, I'm dating myself, but
Cave person day.
Shows like Transformers, G.I. Joe, He-Man, the animation for those shows were outsourced to animators, mostly in Japan. Even within, let's say, the last 10 years, shows like The Legend of Korra, Gravity Falls, The Witcher, they're all animated largely in South Korea. The Netflix animated show Arcane is animated in France in conjunction with other studios across Europe and the United States. Most Japanese anime, for instance, is of course done in Japan, but these days a lot of it is outsourced to independent animators across the globe who've been showing off their skills on social networks like Instagram and Twitter, for instance. Some backgrounds for shows like Rick and Morty were done here in Barbados, as a matter of fact. All this to say that it's more often than not an enormous team effort. It's a ton of hard work. It's helpful for clients to know this information because then they understand that in order to get a quality animated product, it will take a lot of time.
Levi vs. Kenny, which took a month to animate, and Levi vs. the Beast Titan, which took a month to storyboard and 3 months to animate.
And it will take a lot of money. But it's also helpful for you to know this because you'll be able to negotiate the time that you need to do the best job that you can. You'll be properly compensated for your work. And most importantly, it can free you of the expectation of needing to be this one-person army, especially if you're an independent animator just working completely by yourself. So this now is where understanding the various disciplines comes in. Very few people excel at everything. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. So when studying animation, it's good to pick a focus and find out which part of the team would best suit your skills. Now, when people think about animation, the first thing that truly enters their mind is character animation, making the characters themselves act and move around. There are different ways of doing this depending on what form of animation you're using. If you're doing traditional 2D animation, it requires drawing individual pictures or frames and then flipping through those frames to create motion. Then there's CGI animation, or computer-generated imagery, where you sculpt a character almost like you would with clay, except in a computer, and then you move that character around. We mostly see this in 3D animated films or with larger-than-life characters in live-action films. And we especially see it a lot with video games. More recently, there is puppet animation, where you essentially draw a character, give them joints, and then you move their limbs around in programs like After Effects and Toon Boom. This is done commonly today for shows like Rick and Morty and Star Trek The Lower Decks, but was even done without computers as far back as the 1920s, where a German woman created the first animated film using paper cutouts, and also predating Disney's first animated film by a good 11 years. So for the sake of this example, we'll delve into traditional 2D animation, because even within this specific discipline, you'll find different teams. There are keyframe animators, artists who draw the major poses within a single motion. Then there are in-betweeners, artists who then quite literally draw the poses between those major drawings that the keyframers did. Then you have the cleanup artists, people who go back over the rough work of the keyframers and the in-betweeners to make sure all the outlines are crisp and each drawing is on model. And then of course we have the coloring department, tasked with going through and coloring and shading each of those frames once they've been cleaned. Now, I just mentioned the idea of keeping drawings on model. What does that even mean? That takes us to the next discipline that I wanted to discuss: character design. Someone has to decide what these characters are going to look like. Will the style be realistic or cartoonish? What kind of clothes will they wear? How many belts do they have? The character designer decides all of this and then puts a sheet together with the character in different poses to help the animators stay on model. Or rather, draw the character in the same way every time, or at least as much as humanly possible. Okay, anyway, enough of all that. What about the script? What are these characters going to say? What about your team of animators? How will they know what each scene is going to look like? This is where the disciplines of screenwriting and storyboarding come in. Before we even get to animation and character design, someone has to come up with the idea to write the screenplay, plan out the dialogue, the fun gags, the action sequences, And after that, another team has to draw out a rough idea of how each of those sequences will actually look. Storyboards are basically like a rough comic version of your animation. These days, this process can bleed into also creating what they call an animatic. This is essentially a video version of the storyboard, usually created once the voice acting and some of the music is completed. This also helps to give the animation team an idea of the timing behind each sequence. How long it takes for a character to run from one place to another, or slap someone in the face, or kick someone in the balls, or whatever else. Now, while the storyboards and the animatic are passed off to the animators, and they're doing their job, there is usually another equally important process going on in and around this time. Background artists are equally just as essential to the process. Layout artists as well, for that matter. They're not just designing the backgrounds for each sequence, but they're also creating the mood for the show itself, the atmosphere for the show. This brings me to the final disciplines that I'm going to cover here, and that's effects animation and digital compositing. These are the two processes which truly make the animation sing. They enhance the character animation and complete the overall mood and tone set up by the layout, background artists, and art directors. Usually all of the colored animation and backgrounds are put into a program called After Effects that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and most of the digital compositing, things like light from a flickering candle or light from the moon or sun rays, are all added in that program. And of course, the thing is, this is all nothing without someone to direct the entire project. Someone who's good at making sure every department has enough time to do what they need to do, and make sure that the overall vision is coming together as consistently as it should at the end of the day. Now, the beauty of animation school is that you get to dabble in a little bit of everything. This is where you get to figure out what aspect of animation you like the most. Animation is a huge, wide world. And if you're interested, it's easier to get into it now than it's really ever been at all. So with that, I'm going to let you all go, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for pulling the curtain back and showing, how some of the shows that grace our screens are made. So as we continue to explore the gig economy, let's now hear from Dr. James Carmichael. An alumnus of Harrison College, Dr. Carmichael is what we describe as a 21st century Renaissance man, being a technologist, a researcher, an award-winning educator, a creative writer, athlete, and a linguist. His love of computers and foreign languages led him to pursue studies in both the arts and sciences, and eventually resulted in earning his doctorate and Master of Science in Software Engineering from the University of Sheffield in the UK. This is after having earned undergraduate and postgraduate degrees, a Bachelor of Arts in French and Master of Arts in Spanish from the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus.
All of you.
He has recently served as Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. Currently, he teaches computer science at the University of Nassau in the Bahamas. His research endeavors lie in the domains of algorithm development for computerized speech processing, as well as investigating novel techniques to improve internet-based information retrieval. Please welcome Dr. James Carmichael, who will help us to explore the value of the gig economy. Dr. Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Ms. Archibald. That was a very, very flattering opening introduction, and wow, I hope we can live up to it. You know what? I think I'm going to start. Let's have a little bit of fun, shall we? We just had a very, very captivating talk about animation. So maybe we should start there, not with animation as such, but shall we say with an idea of what of a gig worker. Let's have a look at a gig worker, shall we? Why not? So hang on there. Let me just go here a second. And let's just go here a second.
All right, listen, come on. We all substitute teacher, Mr. Crosby. I taught school for 20 years in the inner city. Don't even think about messing with me. Y'all feel me? Let's roll here. Quella. Let's say Quella now. Don't say Quella here?
Do you mean Jacqueline?
Balake. Where is Balake at? There's no Balake here today. That's it. My name's Blake.
Okay, now what we just saw there was a bit of a comic skit, as we say. But remember when I said to you, I will show you a gig worker. Of course, you're expecting perhaps a musician. But if you paid careful attention to what was said just now, you realize that that gig worker was a teacher. But a teacher unlike anything we've ever had in Barbados, because Barbados and most of the Eastern Caribbean, well, the whole Caribbean really, we don't do substitute teachers, do we? If a teacher is absent or late or sick, what do we do in Barbados? We say, well, you got the whole strain. In the UK and the USA and in France, you have teachers who have careers in simply being substitute teachers. When people are sick, when teachers are sick, these guys come in, teach for a day, 2 days, and then they're gone. Now that's the whole thing about. I'm gonna start it here. That's the whole thing about this idea of can gig equal big? Seriously, can gig be a big part of the world economy? And I would say more so the Caribbean economy. So as I said here, what do we see here? We see on the right hand side, well, that's a classic gig worker, Uber driver. So we know about him. Notice also that there is somebody there, an agent, who is phoning in a gig. Yeah. As we heard just now from the previous speaker, we have programmers, animators, also the people who, they do their own gig too. They send in software, they send in source code from all over the world. It's not uncommon to have Indian software programmers sending in their stuff to America, which is literally halfway across the world. But how about this guy in the lower left-hand corner? Ah, a political consultant. Is that a gig worker? Well, yes, by definition. Do you remember? Well, you probably do. I'll be a bit controversial here. In the recently held elections, or the elections of January this year, there was a certain campaign strategist who was chastised for, let us say, jumping ship. And a certain Hartley Henry, a fellow political consultant, said, this person is a consultant. They can sell their services anywhere. That's how they earn their living. That's how they earn their gigs. Who would have thought that? So what's a gig? Well, according to the Oxford Online Dictionary, a gig is any job, especially one of short or uncertain duration. And the gig economy, a segment of the service economy based on flexible, temporary, or freelance jobs, often connecting clients and customers through an online platform. So, by the way, how is a gig worker any different from a self-employed person? Well, by definition, a self-employed person does not work for anybody, but he deals, but somebody else. So a self-employed person deals directly with the customer. That's not the case of a gig worker. In fact, a gig worker is more like a freelancer. In other words, then, a gig worker is hired by somebody else. A gig worker, unlike a self-employed person, a gig worker is hired by some employer. The only critical difference between a gig worker and the standard regular worker is that a regular worker is on payroll. He gets his pension, or he will get his pension when the time is right. He will get his health benefits. He will get his vacation pay. A gig worker gets none of that. A gig worker is a freelancer, a kind of a mercenary, if you may. In fact, the term freelancer has military origins. It was first applied to 13th century mercenaries who had lances. So they had lances that they could use. They were free to use their lances how they liked. So they were freelancers. Sounds crazy, but true. So a gig worker is the nearest freelancer was what gig workers were called before it became gig workers. And by the way, how did gig get so big? It seems like just what, last 2-3 years, it was gig work and stuff like that. Well, we gotta blame a little fellow called Mr. COVID-19. During the 2-year COVID pandemic, 114 million people worldwide lost their jobs. That's according to the International Labor Organization. Think about that. 114 million people lost their jobs. Many of them never got those jobs back. And in fact, many of them did not even want to go back to gigging to make a living. I know personally that when I was living in Dubai, Emirates Airlines laid off over half of their pilots and their air hostesses. It's staggering. And of course, know that the economy is picking back up again. They want them back. And some are saying, no, we are going to be the masters of our own destiny. But we don't want to be totally self-employed. We still want to maybe hire ourselves out, but to people who we have no allegiance to whatsoever. And on that note, there are, well, of course, who is the ultimate or the iconic gig employer? Uber, right? You have Uber drivers, Uber Eats, Uber everything. Is it nice to work for Uber? Let's find out something here a second. So I'm gonna pause this. I'm gonna pause this presentation for a second. And I'm going to just go here. I'm gonna just go here to, right, here we go.
The Supreme Court has ruled that a group of Uber drivers must be treated as workers rather than self-employed, a decision which means they could be entitled to minimum wage and holiday pay. The decision marks the end of a 5-year legal battle case, could have implications for many others. With more, here's our transport correspondent, Caroline Davis.
The Supreme Court unanimously dismissed Uber's appeal.
Brilliant. So years of fighting. Today, outside the Supreme Court, Yasmin and James heard the decision they've been waiting for, that when driving Uber, they were workers, not self.
delighted. I think essentially companies like Uber, these big platforms, workers can fight. Yes. They spend millions of pounds trying to feed workers. I mean, it's reprehensible that they've done this, but I'm just so delighted, thrilled, and relieved.
Worker status is not the same as an employee, but it means that they have rights to a minimum wage and holiday. The right link which members with passengers, Uber has always claimed it's an intermediary. That was rejected by the Supreme Court. Uber say this judgment only applies to the drivers that first brought the case in 2017, not to every Uber driver in the country, because Uber say they've made changes since then. Some drivers and lawyers would disagree. Today, the court set out the reasons why it thought these Uber drivers were workers, which included the fact that Uber set the pay and the contract without any say from the drivers. How today's verdict will affect today's drivers and other workers will be the subject of future court cases.
Okay, now that's interesting. So Uber tried to have the best of both worlds. They wanted to say, oh, but anyway, Uber claims, and they're probably right. Uber is a taxi company, basically, that has no taxis. Uber has no taxis, not even one. What is Uber actually? Uber is simply gig procurer. What's that exactly? A gig procurer is somebody who gets a gig for you. So what Uber says it is, Uber simply connects drivers to those who want to ride. That's all that Uber does. Well, according to the courts of the UK, this was a case in February of 2021. They said, no, Uber, you are an employer. And if you are an employer, please give the correct and requisite rights to vacation, rights to pension, rights to medical coverage. Please do it. But that's the problem actually with this gig economy as it is expanding. They are becoming, well, that's how I suppose some employers are. This is the big challenge of going gig, that we must not go inhumane while we go gig. And to get back to our slides here. Sorry, let's just go back quickly. So when we are thinking about going gig, it's not only a matter of technology, internet and stuff like that, because basically Uber is an internet company. Uber wouldn't exist were it not for the internet. A big part of the gig economy is for the most part internet based. So how do we think gig? How do we think gig? Because it demands a different mindset than what went before. There's a certain Liam Nielsen. I'm sure all of you have seen that movie, Taken. He said, he has a job that demands he possess a certain specific set of skills. Gig workers must also possess a certain specific set of skills. By the way, this is already being done for lawyers. At UWI's, at the University of West Indies Law School, the Hubert Law School, do they learn more law? No, they learn how to manage a business. There was a very interesting talk yesterday where some Harrison College students presented, learning about financial management. Gig workers must do that too. They must learn how to manage a business as a self-employed person. They must also learn other skills like contract negotiation. Those taxi drivers would have done well to have learned how to negotiate contracts, because don't forget, gig workers will have contracts. And of course, they also need a bit of conflict resolution and other what are called emotional soft skills, which are very, very important. So don't think about going big with gig you must also think about thinking gig, getting into that gig mindset. So another thing about this gig economy, don't forget that nowadays in the information age, the only constant thing is change. I mean, do you all remember when Microsoft Office first came out? Or when the Windows operating system first came out? Windows XP, you know, and now we are what? Windows 11. Every, yeah, roughly every 2 years, something new comes out from Microsoft. The pace of change is, it's, it hurts my head, but that is the world we live in. That's the information age we live in. So gig workers must engage in lifelong learning, and continuous skills upgrading is a must. But let's know there's a little interesting thing here, which is very often people think, oh, I'm a regular worker. I have my 9 to 5 job, my pension plan, my health benefits. Will these gig workers, come and take our jobs? In other words, will gig workers become, what can we say? Will gig workers become strike breakers? Is it possible? Well, I put it to you that in the Caribbean context, especially the Barbadian context, that need not be and should not be. First of all, how do we pay gig workers? I would say, for example, that gig workers should be paid at a higher rate to cover the cost of them having to sort out their own insurance plans, vacation pay, health benefits, and so on and so forth. So, for example, if you're in teaching and you are going to be a gig teacher, if that ever happens in Barbados, then gig teachers, you would have to first of all work out the pay of a regular teacher. And that's pretty easy. I mean, you just basically take the person's gross salary and divide by 30 days. So take the monthly gross salary, divide by 30 days, and that would be a daily rate. And then I would suggest, on top of the daily rate, adding on another 10%. So that 10% which the gig worker will earn in addition to the regular worker. That's saying, Mr. Gig worker, Mr. Gig teacher, Mr. Gig programmer, you have to sort out your own health insurance coverage, your own vacation pay. So for that, we give you a little something on the top. Now, there's a price to pay. Number one price is gig workers don't have to have loyalty to anyone but themselves. I mean, they should be professional, but the idea of workplace loyalty, nobody is loyal to them. So go figure. So gig workers, workplace loyalty, employer loyalty is optional, not required. As a matter of fact, in many cases, like gig teachers, substitute teachers, they are not, or they should not be given certain administrative jobs, like being a yearhead, because a yearhead is a position that requires a certain amount of continuity, and it would tie a gig worker down to a specific school, and that's not what should happen. By the way, employers will know if they will focus their workforce on gig workers, there will have to be some type of gig procurer. In the old days, we used to call them employment agencies. So an employer would call up some agency and basically get a person, say, hey, I want to have a programmer or what have you. So we will have to have a new breed of entity, the gig procurer. As a matter of fact, a gig procurer might work across several different types of jobs. Another thing, please, people, please, please, please. You know the old routine in Barbados and most countries around the world, when you're 65, you stop being alive. Got to go and retire. Why? If you're a gig worker. Now, of course, governments, they want you to retire for several reasons. They want the new members of the workforce who are coming in to get jobs. You can't have, James Carmichael hanging on till he's 80 and stopping some youngster from getting a job, can you? But that's the whole issue. If James Carmichael goes from being a teacher to now being a gig teacher, a substitute teacher, I will not be there competing with youngsters like David Simpson. No, it's if he's a teacher, when David Simpson is sick, feels a bit under the weather, and he can't come to work, they'll call old, dithering James Carmichael, and whether he is 60 or 600, the only thing that should matter is James Carmichael fit and capable of doing the job? So a gig worker should have no age limits. End of story. The only criterion should be competence. Remember, the important thing is not to find a steady job. The important thing for the gig worker is to find steady work. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. That's all there is to it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, James.